Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. The life of the Prophet Muhammad, eighth session, the last session. Brothers and sisters all over the world, Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin. Wassalatu wassalamu ala asyrafil anbiya'i wal mursalin wa ala alihi wa ashabi ajma'in. Let me repeat some of the explanation yesterday. The first Muslim army came back to Yathrib with Meccan prisoners who were mostly of the same tribes as the Prophet, who treated them with mercy and sent them home. In the third year of the Hijrah, while the Prophet was, as usual, absorbed in his worship and in his preaching, he consolidated the position of his ummah and looked after the defense of his city. Neither were his enemies idle. 1 year later, they were ready and again marked on Yathrib with a force 3 times as large as the one defeated at Badr. The Prophet moved to engage them, and they met on the slope of the Mount Uhud. The fierce battle ended with the retreat of the Muslim forces and the wounding of the Prophet. But through his endurance and his resourceful and courageous leadership, he managed to save his small army. Abu Sufyan, who was leading the Meccans, called from the top of the hill, saying, Uhud for Badr, we call it even. We will meet again next year. Both forces retired to their original bases, but that was not the end. Uhud, like Badr, was not decisive. 2 years later, Quraysh built up a much larger force, allied itself to many tribes, and was able to mobilize an army of 10,000 men. It was well armed and equipped, and thus far greater than any force that the Prophet could muster. The attackers laid siege on Yathrib, and for 2 weeks pressed to break through, but they failed. The Prophet had introduced new defense tactics, digging trenches and raising barricades, at which he himself labored with the men day and night. The Prophet's faith in God and the great zeal of his followers, particularly the Muhajirin and Ansar, balanced the enemy's superiority in arms and numbers. A severe wind blew, accompanied by a dust storm. The morale of the Ahzab faltered with the evening. They argued among themselves and ultimately broke camp and retired. The Muslims followed them a certain distance, That was the Quraysh attempt to destroy its enemy base in Yathrib. A year later, that is in the sixth year of the Hijrah, the Prophet moved in force toward his home city, Makkah. He wanted to make his lesser pilgrimage, Umrah, to the Kaaba, which, although it housed pagan idols, was still regarded by Muslims as sacred, because in the view of the Prophet, the Kaaba had been built by the patriarch Abraham for the worship of God. It was in the vicinity of the Kaaba, near the well of Zamzam, that Abraham had settled his Egyptian wife Hajar with her son Ismail. The Qurayshis and other northern Arab tribes were the descendants of Abraham, though through his son Ismail. The Muslims therefore believed that they had the right to perform the pilgrimage initiated by their great father Abraham, the first Arab to worship Allah, the only God. Brothers and sisters all over the world, but the Makkans disagreed with them and sought to bar their entry. Finally, a 10-year truce was concluded with Quraysh, whereby the Prophet agreed, among other things, to postpone his pilgrimage to the following season. The mark on Mecca and the truce that resulted therefore from constitute a turning point in Muslim history. For the first time, the right of every person to preach and practice his faith freely was recognized by a formal treaty. A year after conclusion of the truce, the Prophet and 2,000 men entered Mecca, which, according to previous agreement, was evacuated temporarily of its inhabitants. The Muslims completed their pilgrimage in an admirable manner and impressed the Meccan to such an extent that conversion to Islam increased by leaps and bounds. Delegations were sent by Arabian tribes from the four corners of the peninsula to pledge their loyalty to Muhammad in Yathrib. When 2 years later the Qurayshis violated their treaty obligation and attacked the Khuza'as tribe, which was allied with the Muslim, the Prophet led a march on Mecca on Wednesday, the 10th of Ramadan, in the 8th year of Hijrah, Anno Domini 630, with 10,000 men. On that memorable day, the Prophet asked the Meccan, "What do you think I will do to you?" They answered, "You are a generous brother and the son of a generous brother. Go." The Prophet rejoined, "You are freed." Lane Pool writes, the day of Muhammad's greatest triumph over his enemies was also the day of the grandest victory over himself. He freely forgave Quraysh all the years of sorrow and cruel scorn with which they had afflicted him, and gave an amnesty to the whole population of Mecca for criminals whom justice condemned, made up Muhammad's proscription list when, as a conqueror, he entered the city of his bitterest enemies. The army followed in his example and entered quietly and peace, peaceably. No house was robbed, no women insulted, no one thing alone suffered destruction. Going to the Kaaba, Muhammad stood before each of the 360 idols and pointed to them with his staff, saying, truth is come, and falsehood is fled away. And at these words, his attendant hewed them down, and all the idols and household gods of Mecca and round about were destroyed. After the conquest of Mecca, Muhammad had to march on another stubborn enemy, Al Ta'if, the important dwelling place of the much exalted idol god Hubal. It was the city to which the Prophet had journeyed in his worst days of persecution, seeking refuge, but receiving humiliation instead. 10 years had elapsed since then, and now he believed, and now he believed that the victory in Mecca might persuade the inhabitant of the Taif to sue for peace. On the contrary, they mobilized the great Hawazin confederacy of tribes against him, and relied the city people for the decisive day with the enemy of their God. The two forces met at Hunain. The Muslims were then commanding the largest force in their history to date, but they were being routed and were retaining when the Prophet relied the old Ansar and Muhajirin veteran, fighting courageously. Though Muhammad was wounded, they won the day. The Prophet was so generous and forgiving to his old enemies and persecutors that some of these followers among the Ansar objected, but the Prophet soothed them with wise and fair exhortation and played upon their sympathies until they wept. Upon returning to Yathrib, Muhammad encountered delegation sent by tribes and settled peoples of Arabia. They came to pay homage to him and to profess the faith of Islam. Thus was Arabia won over to Islam. But what about the rest of the world? Muhammad always conceived of his mission as being directed to all people. Already he had sent his emissaries to Arabia's neighboring emperors, the Persian and Roman Byzantine, who ignored his message or humiliated the messengers. The only courteous response was from the Coptic leaders of Egypt. In southern Syria, modern Jordan, certain of his emissaries were brutally murdered, which occasioned the battle at Mut'ah later. For some years after their enemy defeat at Mut'ah, the Muslims were in state of war with the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius, who was said to be gathering together a large force in Syria to deal with the new Arab menace on his southern frontier and to liquidate the new Arab ruler who entertained such serious pretensions. For this and other reason, the Prophet decided to prepare a large army and march north. This was the last military expedition he was to plan. He had pointed out the direction. A short time after his death, his companion marched north, and 4 years later, they conquered both mighty empires, the East Roman and the Persians. In the 10th year of the Hijrah, the Prophet made his last pilgrimage to Mecca and delivered his farewell speech at Mina to a congregation of 40,000 Muslims. His comments, "O people, listen to me. I may not ever meet you again here after this year." Then, in a great sermon, he expressed his fears that they might lose the way of God and return to a lawless society and to tribal feuds. He ended a great law giving speech by asking them if they thought that he had faithfully delivered his message. They answered with one voice, "Yes." He then said, "God, you are my witness," and descended from his camel. The Muslims call that sermon the farewell speech and that pilgrimage the farewell pilgrimage. Since the Prophet first called by the angel Gabriel 23 years earlier, revelation after revelation had continued. He had learned them by heart and inscribed them, and so had his friends. They formed together the glorious book of Islam, the Quran, the Holy Quran. At the end of this sermon, And as a final word, he recited in the name of God this revelation. This day I, Allah, have perfected your religion for you and completed my favors unto you and have chosen for you as religion al-Islam. His dear friends then wept. They laughed that they felt that his end was near, that the prophet had fulfilled his mission, and it was so. The prophet died of fever in Yathrib, which thereafter was called Al-Madinah. His life, suffering, and triumph will remain for Muslim and non-Muslim alike a symbol of modesty, faithful devotion, and dedicated service to God, a high example of manhood. Let me repeat the last verse of the Al-Quran that revealed and mentioned by Muhammad at that time. Al-yawma akmaltu lakum dinakum wa atmamtu alaikum ni'mati wa raditu lakumul Islam madina, means this day I, Allah, have perfected your religion for you and completed my favor unto you and have chosen for you as religion al-Islam. So, brothers and sisters all over the world, we have finished reading the history of the Prophet Muhammad to you. May God bless you wherever you are. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.